Chapter 13. Waver's Great Test. During the period of rest at the cleft of the rock, Waver gained strength rapidly. Fresh air, sleep, good food, water from the spring, the company of his fellow soldiers, and the presence of his beloved sword by his side all combined to bring back the spring to his step and strength to his arm. They stayed there 3 days. "I want to give Waver a chance to get as strong as possible," Jamin told Lannis. "You see, we can't expect more trouble from the enemy between here and the castle. If we could have come straight through without stopping, we might have reached the castle gates without further attack, but Waver was too weak for that." "What makes you sure they will attack us again?" asked Lannis. "One is never sure about the enemy, Lannis, but it is not likely that he will let a captive get away without a further try." It was early on the third day when the party finally left the high pinnacle and entered the shadows of the forest below. They traveled single file, Jamin first, then Waver, then Lannis, with Robin bringing up the rear. They moved rapidly without stopping, their shields ready on their left arm and their swords drawn in their hands, and to avoid possible ambushes, Jamin led them by little-known paths. But it seemed that there was little reason for caution. Mile after mile dropped behind, and the forest remained quiet and peaceful. Perhaps, Lannis thought, the enemy had given up after all. Perhaps the evil ones thought that they were already safe in the king's castle, or perhaps they were watching over other paths. But Jamin, leading the group, still moved warily, flicking his eyes constantly from side to side over the ground in front of them, and looking carefully at each boulder or thicket which might conceal an enemy. Early in the afternoon, the trail dipped downward into a shadowy woodland, where it wound between giant boulders. Then it turned upward again, following the course of a narrow valley where the shadows were deep. As they neared a bend in the path, Jamin suddenly motioned them to stop. Lannis, looking ahead over Waver's shoulder, saw that the light cast by Jamin's sword was flaring brightly. They listened, but all was still. Not even the usual bird and insect noises were heard. After a moment, at Jamin's signal, they moved forward again, slowly, their muscles tense. The party approached the bend of the path, making as little noise as possible. As they rounded a turn, Lannis drew in his breath sharply. Ahead, the path sloped upward between two large rocks, and there, standing on the shadowed path between the boulders, tall and sinister, was one of the enemy. He was dressed in black armor, with a huge black sword bare in his right hand, and he stood quietly waiting, as motionless as one of the rocks themselves. Jamin turned to the others. "Here our troubles begin," he said in a low voice. "Follow close behind me, while I clear this one out of the way. Then watch out for attacks from the side and rear." He started forward, but Waver, who had been staring white-faced at the sinister figure, suddenly whispered, Wait, Jamin, I beg of you. I know who this is, and why he is here." Jamin halted, still with a watchful eye on the enemy, and Waver moved to his side. "That is the evil one who captured me, and who tormented me daily in my cell at Castle Despair," said Waver, trembling. "He has come to take me back with him." "I'll take care of him," said Jamin, preparing to start forward again. "No," said Waver, "you do not understand. He it was who told me that even if I had had my sword that night, he still would have beaten and captured me, and I told him that the king's sword could vanquish him in any field." He seized Jamin's shoulder. "Don't you see? That is why he is here alone, to prove my words. If you drive him away now, he will rise up before me in every battle hereafter. I must beat him single-handedly, or die in the attempt." Jamin lowered his sword. "Perhaps you are right, lad," he said softly. "We can break through and carry you to the castle, but until you yourself, with the king's weapons, win the victory over that which enslaved you, it will be an empty triumph. Go, and may our Lord and King guide your arm. We will keep watch, for other evil ones are certainly about." As the three looked on breathlessly, Waver, his face pale but set and determined, moved forward alone along the path. As he did so, his opponent too, matching him step for step, came forward from between the rocks into the lighter shadow of the trees. When only a few paces separated them, they stopped and stood facing each other for a moment. Neither spoke, but from the slopes around them the high-pitched wailing sound rose. A cloud darkened the valley, and a clammy chill fell across the place like the chill of the Valley of Despair. Then, above the wail of evil rang the clear, beautiful notes of Waver's trumpet, and his sword flashed as he leapt forward to the attack. It was the most furious duel that Lannis had yet seen. The huge black sword of the enemy swung in a whistling arc, clashing blow after blow against Waver's shield of faith, and Waver struck out in return. Toe to toe they stood, each swaying with the force of the blow striking them, but neither giving ground. Then Waver seemed to tire. He was forced backward one step, then two. Lannis and Robin would have rushed forward, but Jamin shook his head. He must finish it alone, he said. A furious overhand blow got past Waver's shield and struck his left shoulder at the joint in his armor, wounding him. The force of the blow drove Waver to his knees, and the enemy, with a snarl of hate, leapt forward, raining blows on the upraised shield of the king's soldier. Lannis groaned, but with a burst of almost superhuman strength, Waver fought his way back to his feet, reeling under the blows of the relentless black sword. For a moment he stood, gathering strength for another effort. Then Waver cried out, "For the king!" He lunged forward recklessly, swinging his sword in a great two-handed stroke which caught the enemy by surprise and drove his shield in against his body. Again the sword flashed, and this time it sheared through the shield and armor. For the third time Waver's sword whistled through the air, and the evil one slumped to the path. His sword clattered loosely on the stones. For an instant the three watchers stood motionless, stunned by the suddenness with which the end had come, while Waver, his breath coming in deep sobs, leaned heavily on his sword above the body of his enemy. "Forward quickly," said Jamin, and sprang to Waver's side, and with Lannis and Robin supporting the wounded soldier on either side, the little party rushed through the rocks. They were none too quick, for the wailing noise had grown louder, and from the slopes other of the enemy left their hiding places behind trees and bushes and rushed forward down the path to intercept them. Quickly the three formed in a tight defensive knot with Waver in the center, and as they beat back the attacks of the enemy, moved step by step up the path towards the open ridge. It was a long struggle, but not a hopeless one. There were not many evil ones in the group guarding this path, and they seemed confused and disheartened at the loss of their leader. As the fight neared the sunlit summit, the enemy's attack slackened, and when they finally broke out into the sunlight, the last of the enemy dropped away down the slope. Jamin led the way along the ridge until he felt it was safe to rest. Then, while the others stood guard, he examined Waver's wound. "A deep cut, but not too serious," he said, washing the wound carefully with the water which he had brought from the cleft of the rock. Then, to Lannis's surprise, Jamin drew his sword, and gently touched the flat of the blade to the still bleeding wound. Seeing Lannis's astonished face, Jamin smiled. "There is no end to the wonders of the sword, Lannis, as I told you before. What is death to the enemy is life and healing to the soldier of the king. The touch of the sword prevents infection of the wound, and starts it mending. See, the bleeding is stopped." And Waver, sitting on the ground, said, "I feel better already, Jamin. I believe I'm strong enough to travel again." "We'll rest a little longer while I bind up your wound," decided Jamin. "It is reasonably safe here, and we have plenty of time to get to the castle before nightfall. I think we may have seen the last of the enemy for today." When the wound was bound, Jamin again led the way along the ridge toward home. His guess proved to be right, for though they kept a sharp lookout, they saw no more of the enemy. A few hours later, they came in sight of the familiar castle gates, and soon afterwards were enjoying rest and food in the friendly warmth of the castle hall.